There is a feeling in life that nobody likes, that everybody experiences.
At some point in their life.
At least at some point, and usually more frequently than they want to.
Yeah.
And it's all happening in the head.
Right. Now we call this feeling anxiety.
Exactly. Hi, welcome to the Aping Along podcast. The podcast where I, Noah, and my closest friend, Luke, have an open conversation with each other about what it means to live a good life. We share stories, insights, techniques, and thoughts that may help you on your path to improving the well-being of yourself and other apes like you. In this second episode, we discuss our experience with social anxiety and two paradigms that have helped us tremendously with managing negative emotions: mindfulness meditation and acceptance. Enjoy.
I think it would be good to start off by saying that we're not necessarily talking about general anxiety, but the type of anxiety that we mostly experienced or have experienced is social anxiety. Now, of course, that sort of translates to general anxiety, but we have mostly been haunted by this feeling of things that may go terribly wrong, right? So it's, as you said earlier, it happens completely in the mind. And what kind of happens is you anticipate this social event, and it may just be the most mundane and dull task in your life of greeting someone you have never met before. So you're going to introduce yourself, and you know that this will happen or you're going to a party where you only know a few people. And this means that you will have to introduce yourself like 20 times or whatever. Well, you may not necessarily have to introduce yourself 20 times, but you feel like you'll have to introduce yourself at least once. And this causes an uneasy feeling. And uneasy may be an understatement in some cases. It's sort of a feeling that you worry a lot about what could potentially go wrong here. And this is based on past experiences mostly. When you do something completely for the first time and you cannot relate it to any past experience, I find that I would be less likely to feel anxious about it. If, however, I can relate it somehow to any uncomfortable feeling in social context that I have felt before, it is likely easier for me to feel socially anxious about it. So with the example of introducing yourself to someone, this feeling might arise in the form of you worrying a lot about saying the wrong thing or greeting someone with an improper, well, let's call it a metaphorical handshake. So you might give someone an actual handshake, but you might also hug someone or give them a high five or give them a fist bump or whatever. But doing so in the wrong context may cause anxious feelings, or not remembering their name and having to ask for it again later may also cause this. And these are thoughts that will occur before you have introduced yourself, which will complicate the action of introducing yourself to someone else.
It's interesting that as we think about anxiety, we immediately segue into social anxiety, which is the type of anxiety that I think we experience the most of the different types of anxiety.
Yeah, definitely.
Anxiety it's different from fear, and it's also, but it's the feeling itself is actually pretty close to being excited, strangely enough.
Yeah, let's capitalize on that for a second, because why is it?
Well, okay, so let's start with why it's different from fear, because that's...
Sure.
So with fear, there is, it's a direct response to something happening, some stimulus in your surroundings. You're usually fearful for your life. That's usually what fear means.
Right.
You see a bear, you see somebody, you're worried that somebody might be a psychopath.
You're standing on top of a cliff.
Right. Or you're walking down a dark alleyway in the middle of the night. So fear is a direct response. But anxiety happens before an event.
Yes, it's in anticipation of an event.
Exactly. And now there are people, obviously, with real disorders who feel anxiety for no particular reason. They're not really ruminating their thoughts on something actual that might be happening to them in the future. There's not somewhere they need to go or some presentation they need to give. But in a normal context, in a healthy context, anxiety is a sort of a preparation of your brain for what's about to happen.
Right.
Now, the second thing that's interesting is that what you notice physically is usually some tension in the stomach area or in your shoulders, usually difficulty breathing a little bit.
Maybe some sweaty palms.
Exactly. Raised heart rate. When you're excited about something, you can't stop thinking about something that's about to happen. And it's new and it's interesting, and your body is preparing for it in the same way that your body is preparing for events that may be dangerous to you.
So these feelings really look alike, or they feel alike, I should say. Now, please don't mistake this for any sort of medical advice, but I think that we're probably going to warn every listener about our so-called medical advice every single episode.
Exactly.
But so this is where I personally find it interesting to trick the mind and convince, or not even convince, but expose yourself to the idea that when you are feeling anxious, you may actually, in fact, be feeling excited. So I find this interesting because tricking the mind that when you're feeling anxious for something, you might actually be feeling excited is a really powerful trick, because it allows you to take what I would call mental distance. Allows for you to take a deep breath and consider that you were likely just overthinking a lot of stuff. And when you consider that you may have been feeling slightly excited for it instead of anxious, it will contain a lot less tension.
Yeah, and I think it's useful, or it can be useful, to differentiate between the physical feelings, which are usually interpreted as being uncomfortable, and the mental experience, which is just a ruminating thought, which is absolutely pathological. Who are you telling 400 times in a row that, this handshake will go slightly wrong?
Yeah.
And that will be an absolute disaster for the rest of your life.
Yeah. Oh shit, I grabbed this wrong finger.
I held eye contact for a little bit too long.
Yeah.
And also think of, for example, what you think when you see somebody else being anxious. First of all, very often it's hard to see because we're also concerned with ourselves. But when we do see it, very often we hope that this person will feel a little bit more relaxed. We want to help them feel more comfortable and
try to soothe them.
Exactly.
So now that we've defined what anxiety means and how we relate to it, and I've given you some non-medical advice about it, I think it'd be interesting to introduce a story. I'd like to ask you to think back to the last time that you felt really anxious.
Yeah, so this is an easy one. So I just started a new internship.
Right.
This was something that I was quite concerned about because I wanted to leave a good impression. This was a company that I really wanted to be involved with, and it was a great assignment, and I was picked out of a few candidates as well. So I felt some pressure to perform. I didn't want to let them down.
Yeah.
Okay, so the morning of when I started the internship, I sat in the car driving to the location, and I noticed that I had ruminating thoughts about the way I would introduce myself to this new group of people.
Right.
And I had basically the same thought over and over again of a group of people standing there being concerned with themselves. And I just kept holding eye contact and going, and no. And they were concerned with themselves, and I had to really step forward and break their conversation in order to introduce myself. And these people would immediately disapprove of me because they were in the middle of a conversation and I...
Right, and you interrupted them during their conversation.
Exactly. Then, because of the techniques of mindfulness that we've been cultivating for such a long time, I became aware that I was sitting in a car and that all of this was happening in the mind. It wasn't real, it wasn't a reality, which is really doesn't need to be said if everybody knows this, but it's a very powerful thought in such a moment. And I was listening to the sounds, noticing the feeling of sitting in the car. That disconnection from these constantly recurring thoughts was extremely helpful.
So the disconnection was that you were becoming aware of what you were physically experiencing. So the vibrations of the car and the light entering your consciousness.
Yeah, and then I actually remembered, this was before we started the podcast and we thought of names for the podcast. I remembered the idea of Aping Along. Like, I first of all, I noticed how beautiful it is to be alive, right? It's
Right.
incredible that this exists, and how incredibly lucky I also was to have this internship. And then I realized that none of this matters, that, in the grand scheme of my life, this particular experience, whether positive or negative, won't really matter, which is helpful as well. And then I realized that nobody knows what to do in circumstances like this. Not really.
Well, is that the case though? Because we know what to do in the sense that we have agreed that certain things are okay to do, and we've agreed that a lot of things aren't okay to do. For example, you're not going to introduce yourself by pulling down your pants and yelling something. But we have agreed as a society on what the objectives should be. So I thought of this earlier today. I had this training for a pitch a while back, and this was someone who was involved with TED Amsterdam, so she wasn't really that inexperienced, I believe. She gave a presentation about what a pitch should look like and how you can make a good pitch, and discussed several techniques on how to get people their attention, and at some point she just randomly screamed. I don't think she would have considered it a very big audience herself, and her point was that you could get people their attention by doing something unexpected. But you could see that she found it difficult to do that. She found it difficult in the sense that she was kind of laughing a bit stiff afterwards, like, I just did this weird thing, and she was prepared for it because she knew she was going to do it. But because we have agreed with each other that those kinds of anomalies, I would even call it, are undesirable in social context, that may have caused her anxiety. And that's why I think that in some way we do know how we should act.
Yeah, I agree. And I think those rules, however, and that I think was more my point, those rules are very simple, they're very basic, and we already know them. One of the things that still is giving me a lot of anxiety in social situations is the idea that other people must have some incredibly complex information about how to act in social circumstances that I am missing out on.
Well, we do. Well, it was called childhood. It was something you just had to experience. Couldn't miss out on it.
Skipped out on that part. So I agree. I think you're right. There is some social expectations, but I think those expectations are really low. They're just, don't pull down your pants, like things like that are actually very basic. There's a lot of room for improvisation about, exactly who you are and the way you want to present yourself. This realization that we're all just these apes who have these social rules, and we're just trying to be good apes. We're trying to just fit in and ape as well as other people are in these contexts.
Yeah.
That is actually quite a funny idea that we're just, I'm thinking of, just an orangutan just walking through this.
I mean, I guess you missed out on ape school then.
All right, how about you? Do you have a good story?
Yeah, I thought of that earlier before I asked you the question because I anticipated you might ask me. And I think I do have a story, more of a success story though. Because I recently did a presentation to about 30 people, but it was for a company called Unilever. You might have heard of it. It's one of the biggest companies on Earth.
On Earth?
Yeah, it's actually one of the biggest companies on Earth. You've got these other companies like Coca-Cola who pretty much own all of the different types of soda, and Lay's, for example, is also owned by Coca-Cola. Anyway, so it wasn't just that I had to do this presentation for a few interns or something at Unilever. It was that I had to give a presentation to the vice president here in Holland and some other directors as well, the lead of innovation or whatever her title was. So these people were not quite C-level, but they had quite big names within the company. So I had not prepared the presentation as well as I would have liked to, practice it once or twice. Presentations are something that I enjoy doing. I enjoy educating others, but it's also something that is somewhat hard in the sense that at least I am quite aware that when I give a presentation, I'm standing in front of a group and these people will be judging you for what you say, and if you make a mistake, they might laugh at you, and if you say something wrong, they may ask a question about it later, and you have to tell them that you've said something wrong, and you know that these are some important people, not only for the presentation, but also for your career or whatever.
And you're at the center of attention.
Right.
So everybody's eyes are on you, and if you screw something up, everybody will see it.
Yes, there's no chance that anyone will miss it.
Exactly.
Unless you're really boring and everyone is doing something else.
We've all experienced those presentations as well. So.
Yes. In which case you might just scream for some attention. So this was a presentation that I had expected to be quite anxious for, but it turned out not to be that bad, actually. I think the practice helped. Just having rehearsed it once or twice helped a lot. But also realizing that these people are just coming here because they are interested in what I have to tell them. What I have to tell them is something that only I know, and I may bore them. I may have a really interesting story to tell, and it's not really much more than that. It's just you're telling a story in front of some people, and they're interested in it, otherwise they wouldn't be there. Especially when it's such a big company, and especially with people with such busy schedules are showing up. Well, it's not like you're giving a presentation in front of a class where people are feeling as if they're required to listen to you. They're listening to you because they're interested in what you have to tell them. And that is quite a powerful realization. And so when I was done giving the presentation, I realized that I hadn't really felt that anxious at all. And as you can hear by my accent, I don't speak English fluently, sadly. And the presentation was in English as well, so I stumbled here and there. It's not like I experienced those moments as awkward moments or anything. It's just that I realized that those things happen at presentations. And when they do, you might as well admit that they happened and just continue giving your presentation. So what happened here is that I just realized that what I was going to do was a lot more mundane than how I would have thought of it maybe a few years ago, regardless of their position in the company that they work for. These are just people that are just going to listen to what you have to tell them. And what's the worst thing that could actually happen? You say something funny, or you misspeak and they laugh at you, or they don't find it interesting and they walk out, or what's really that bad about something happening like that?
What's really difficult about anxiety, or can be difficult, is how this emotion and these thoughts can completely encapsulate you. It can be very hard to break free from their spell. The interesting thing is that the more you try to run away from it, the bigger the problem usually becomes.
Yeah, resistance is futile.
Exactly, and that's partially because resistance makes you anxious for the anxiety. So you get into this negative feedback loop where you're oh no, I'm anxious, gotta find distraction, gotta do something, this is very uncomfortable, I can't be anxious right now. Yeah. And you don't let the emotion have its place. One practice is the practice of acceptance.
Right.
And in the case of emotion, this means a lot more, but in the case of negative emotion, it's first of all acknowledging that the emotion is present, and then acknowledging whatever that means. So what are the thoughts that are ruminating? But most importantly, perhaps, what do you feel? It's a feeling. How do you notice this feeling is here? What does it feel like? What happens when you give this feeling the space that it apparently needs? One of the first things you notice is the actual physical feeling of emotions are usually not that intense as they seem to be if you're not paying attention to them. They're not as negative. They're just, they're annoying, but they're not really painful.
Yeah. So you've said a lot of interesting things there. Let's just take it one step at a time. So you've said that the first step of acceptance is acknowledging that the feeling is present. How do you do that? Why not say that, no, I'm not feeling anxious. This must be some weird feeling that is definitely not anxiety. I mean, it's not nice to have this feeling, but it's not anxiety. I'm not feeling anxious. Why wouldn't you do that?
The feeling will always win.
Why?
Because it is. So denying reality doesn't work because reality doesn't change. You may deny the existence of gravity as much as you want, but every time you jump up, you're still coming down.
Gonna play devil's advocate here on your analogy, but gravity isn't really a feeling, though.
No, but so there can be truths in the physical world, but there can also be truths in your experience. So whatever your experience is like in this moment, that is a fact that it's like that. Now, there's only one person who can know that, which is you, because of the subjectivity. But, the fact that there is subjectivity and what the subjectivity is like, that is an objective fact.
Yeah.
And so if you're feeling anxious, you are feeling anxious. And no matter how much you deny it, it doesn't change the fact that you are feeling anxious.
Right.
But the real problem here is that the idea or the method that is used is just ineffective. You're trying to get rid of your anxiety at all, in general, but I think most importantly, trying to get rid of it by denying its existence is counterproductive. It will only make the feeling worse.
Right. And so another form is not necessarily denying it, but distracting yourself of the feeling. So just focusing your attention on other things that are also relevant in a certain moment. So for example, you may feel anxious for a presentation, but there's also this other event that you'll attend later that day that you really want to go to because there will be a lot of friends of you there. And you can just focus on that feeling, but it won't eliminate the feeling of anxiety. It may distract you, as you were hoping it will, temporarily, but eventually the anxiety will just come back, and probably will come back even worse, because you've tried to deny it or resist it instead of giving it the space it actually needs. There's a reason you're feeling this feeling, and resisting that is only going to make it worse.
The one person who's listening right now may wonder
how often we're still going to make this joke.
Yeah. Quite a few episodes, I think. So the one person who's listening right now may wonder if there's a dichotomy between what we said earlier and what we're saying right now. Because earlier we were talking about how anxiety may feel very similar to excitement. And it seems that asking yourself the question or trying to reframe your anxiety is a way of distracting yourself or trying to run from the feeling.
Yeah, so I can see how one might think that, because it would look like you are distracting yourself of this feeling. But in fact, you are doing the opposite. You're taking a look at whether this feeling of anxiety actually is what you think it is, and whether it's not just colored by the thoughts that you are constantly having. Because if the thoughts would be colored slightly rosier, wouldn't the feeling be completely different as well?
Exactly. It's just an open question, and it's not trying to force yourself to see it one way or the other.
Which is quite distinct from realizing that you will be going to a party later where a lot of your friends will be, and realizing that you're excited for that and just focusing solely on that feeling of excitement.
Yeah.
We've talked about it without naming it really now, but one elephant in the room here is mindfulness, because we've said that you should accept your feelings, whatever they may be, and we've said that you should inspect them. We've also said that things aren't the way that they seem upon further inspection. And these are all, I'd almost call them components or parts of what one may achieve by practicing mindfulness. We both practice meditation, mindfulness specifically, but we also have experience with other types of meditation, so loving kindness, for example. And meditation is an incredibly useful practice for a lot of different reasons. In this case, I would define meditation or mindfulness as taking a closer look at what is actually going on in your mind, or what one might refer to as consciousness, or everything that may be noticed. When one does that, when you're feeling anxious, one of the first things that you have to do is you have to accept the feeling of anxiety. Because if you won't, then you cannot remain open to your entire experience that you're having besides the anxiety. Now, once you've done that, you can feel other things that are also happening. So this is where the challenge lies, because it may be quite hard to really feel the anxiety for what it is, because it might be painful and you might have never really consciously taken an effort to feel an emotion the way that it is present. But once you've done that, and you persist in inquiring about what you are truly feeling, you will notice that there's other things present. So, to recap to your story that you've told earlier, this is essentially what happened to you when you were somewhat anxious for introducing yourself. And now you've solved this by realizing that, first of all, it's not a reality yet. So this is a very simple realization. It's not even taking a look at the anxiety that you're feeling. It's just taking a look at the fact that you are having a thought, and it's nothing more than a thought. Once you had seen that it's a thought, you were open to the experience of physical sensations. And this is when you could see what the feeling was like for what it truly was, instead of having it amplified by thoughts.
Yeah, there's some openness that is created in conscious experience. I think acceptance is distinct from meditation, but they are similar. A meditation or a state of mindfulness might be a more umbrella term for experiences like acceptance. But I think it's useful to back up a little bit and talk a little bit more about what meditation is. There are two kinds of mindfulness meditation that I know of. So first of all, mindfulness is a state of being that can be achieved through practice. And the first practice might be taking any object of experience, and usually the breath is used, and noticing it for what it is. So noticing, sounds or the breath or whatever you focus on exactly as it is in each moment. And whenever you're distracted by thought or by some other sensation, you revert your attention back to, we call it your anchor. This is an extremely simple practice to do, but it's really hard. You will notice how quickly you get distracted by thought. If you're new to this and you've never tried it, try to focus on your breath, solely on your breath for 10 seconds straight. Now, it's incredibly difficult to do. In fact, you may not even notice, it's very likely that you won't even notice that you are distracted by thought. So this may give the impression that mindfulness is a very tense practice where you're actively concentrating on one thing. And that's not at all the case. The point is to have a passive concentration, a passive noticing. And one of the practices that I practice the most is simply receiving everything and letting everything go. So not focusing on one anchor, but just trying to live in the moment as much as possible. And you notice a thought, and you let it go, and you notice sounds, and you let them go, and it's a constant flux of everything that's happening. Many people who've never tried meditation before may be wondering, why in God's name would I do this? Why would I spend 10 minutes a day doing nothing, essentially? And besides the many scientific studies that have been done on the subject and have shown improvements in concentration, improvements in well-being. I'm not an expert on this, but that's what I've heard. This is your life. This is what it's like to live. And there are insights that you can have about the nature of consciousness, which is the nature of living, really, that are incredibly powerful and incredibly useful and transforming even. And one of the biggest, or perhaps the biggest realization that you might have is it's the complete disconnect, which is would be defined or would be characterized by a loss of self and a distance between thoughts and whoever you feel you are. So thoughts seem like sounds, for example. The best evidence for this, I would say, is that many people throughout, millennia have experienced this, have recorded their experience, and those people have never met. These are different religions, different parts of the world. It's a similar experience, and I'm not saying that any other claims that these people make are true or that they're false. All I'm saying is that there is a truth about what an experience can be like, and Sam Harris talks about this very often, and he's the one who made us aware of meditation practice, and I think we're both very grateful for him.
Yeah, I think it would be safe to say that he's inspired us to go on this journey in the first place and to take a closer look at what is going on in our minds.
And I hope that we can talk about the usefulness of meditation more directly in a future episode. But I think for this episode, we've discussed the nature of anxiety, our experiences with anxiety.
We've discussed some practices that one may take in order to manage these feelings in a healthy way. We've also talked about what mindfulness is for us and tried our best to explain what we think, what you can reach with this practice. We've also talked a little bit about acceptance and what kind of role it may play in managing negative emotions. But these are all topics that are way too big for us to discuss in just one podcast, especially mindfulness and acceptance as well. These are things that we will definitely talk about in another episode. For now, I would like to thank you very much for listening, if you still are. And see you next time.